As I study in my classes a number of complex biological traits like heart disease, asthma, weight gain, cancer, obviously, perhaps the most complicated would be that of personality. I mean, the human brain is the most complex structure in the known universe. What makes us who we are, our individual nuances, etc. Well, certainly this could be studied from the aspect of the environment. How does parenting affect one's personality and the person that you become? You know, your experiences, traumatic events, addiction, schooling, education, nutrition, um, all of these aspects. I'd like to focus a bit on the biology, ending with a number of genetic components. So this is a broad concept. So I'd just like to once again introduce a few topics, especially more on the biological end. Certainly, the brain is the part of the body that controls our thoughts, our desires, our memories. It was originally thought to be the heart, but we now know that it is the brain which is responsible, and specific regions of the brain. The brain is organized into separate sections, and each has its own responsibilities. One of the ways to determine this is to study those who have had some sort of an injury, a head injury, or perhaps a stroke. And we can then identify those regions of the brain which are responsible for heartbeat, for sensation, for moving, etc. And I have a number of videos which go through this. Now, one could argue that, say, the senses do impact on personality. So as we interact with the world, say not being able to smell, not being able to see or hear would certainly have an impact. Or if you, after a stroke, could see someone's face, but not remember who they were. You might recognize, say, the voice of a loved one, and recognize that's my friend, that's my brother, but not necessarily the sight of their face, or vice versa, where you would recognize the sight of them, but not the sound. And so one could certainly argue that this would have some impact on who we are. And so because the brain is such a great area, one could argue that any injury which affects part of the brain might affect the person that we become. Certainly, the areas involved in language. If one were not able to express one's thoughts, if one had damage to Wernicke's area and thus had trouble associating two separate events. So for example, if someone were to say sit here, and you could understand sit and here, but not put them together to mean sit here, well, that would then obviously affect one's ability to understand complex thoughts, and one undoubtedly affect personality. On the topic of personality, perhaps the brain regions which have some of the greatest impacts would be those regarded as the limbic system. The limbic system, its name limbus means two things. One, anatomically, these set of structures are kind of partway between the involuntary brainstem and the voluntary actions of the cerebral cortex. But also functionally, they are in charge of things like emotions and drives. Do we have voluntary control over our emotions? Well, to a degree, yes. Do we have a voluntary control over our drives? Well, to a degree, yes. But then also, things like anger, desire, anxiety, happiness, pleasure, these are not entirely under voluntary control either. And we find that there are individual regions of the brain which govern fear or anger or pleasure, just as there are parts of the brain which say, move this hand. Strokes or brain damage to any of these limbic areas then affect our emotions and our drives, and could thus then clearly have an effect on personality. How could one be the same if one had a different emotional makeup, was quicker to anger, or, had greater phobias and things which generated anxiety. Many of these limbic areas also are important in memory formation, and some strokes can cause varying degrees of amnesia. Once again, this could have a role in personality. How could you be the same person if you couldn't remember your past, remember your childhood, etc.? And so before I get into genes, obviously some aspects of who we are tied to these, areas of brain matter. Because if one area would be damaged, we would be different afterwards. Sometimes after a brain injury, people will say, our friend, our family member, ever since their accident, ever since their stroke, it's like they're a different person. Now, if I were to say, break my arm or lose my arm in an accident, I wouldn't be a different person. I would just be me without an arm. All right. But some individuals after, a brain trauma, people have commented, their emotional makeup is different. So clearly there is a biological aspect to personality in the stuff of the brain. But even if we were to go beyond, just a region of the brain and refer to just how the cells act, why are we the way that we are? What makes us, who we are? Well, the brain is made of cells, nerve cells known as neurons, and they signal each other using chemical signals like neurotransmitters. There are others like neuropeptides and neuromodulators, but so chemical signals are involved in this. So let's take, for example, dopamine. Nerve cells have to make dopamine. So there's a set of chemical reactions. These green things coming in, these are enzymes which change the precursor, tyrosine, which you can eat as an amino acid in the proteins of your last meal, to make dopamine, which is now a signal. So we make our dopamine using enzymes like tyrosine hydroxylase. Now, one of the ways we can study biology is to look for individuals which have variations in some of these genes. So sometimes this is a serious mutation, which makes someone, drastically different from, the typical, in that, they don't make a protein that most people do. But very often this is just a variant allele. So just like there are different forms of hair color in the population, or different forms of eye color, or you can have hair on these digits or not, or roll your tongue or not. There are variations in enzymes. There's a different amino acid at one spot of the enzyme. And then we could say, all right, well, we have two different variants in the population. Do they associate? Can we correlate these variations with any personality differences? And the answer is yes. So variations in the enzymes involved in the production of this signal, dopamine, have been associated with differences in personality. So things like anger, vulnerability, suicidal behavior, predilection to addiction, these are parts which make up our personality. And so some of the genes then which code for the enzymes which make dopamine, they then can be linked to these personality variations and differences. Well, once this nerve cell makes dopamine, it releases it from nerve cell number 1 to nerve cell number 2. And now dopamine is perceived by nerve cell number 2 after binding to a receptor. But once again, I don't necessarily have the same dopamine receptors as you do. I could make more, I could make less, and the ones that I make could be a little bit different from yours. The proteins could have a different amino acid sequence. And so there are variations in dopamine receptor D1, which are associated with some differences in personality. But then the same could be said with a different dopamine receptor D2. You make this receptor, as do I, but we might make slightly different forms of this of this dopamine receptor. And it has been known to be correlated with differences in addiction. So if you have a population and you separate them into whether they have the short form of dopamine receptor D2 or the long form, you could then correlate this with the frequency of addiction is now different in one group on average than others. So once again, here is a suggestion of genes which affect personality. Now, note, there is no gene determining this. So for example, there is no gene which will make me become addicted to something. But if I try a chemical substance, there is receptors which now increase the likelihood that I will become addicted. If I never try cocaine, I will never become addicted to cocaine. But if I do, there are genes which will then affect my likelihood of becoming addicted. There's a dopamine receptor D3, there's a dopamine receptor D4. So when you think of what you did for excitement last weekend, some people, they enjoy, calmer activities, while others, they need that adrenaline rush. They need more active activities to feel pleasure, to, have interest. You can correlate that to a degree with variations in dopamine receptor D4. Once again, here's a part of normal personality, which is affected then by genes. So we have to make dopamine. We have to perceive dopamine with receptors, and then we have to either break it down or reabsorb it. Now, two of the enzymes involved in its breakdown can then vary in a population, and then each of these in both humans and mice. So one can study the mammalian brain, can be involved in a number of personality variations, including aggression. And so the enzyme monoamine oxidase A or COMT, the catechol O-methyltransferase. These are enzymes involved in the breakdown of dopamine, but they can also affect personality traits such as aggression, and in some causing very serious disorders involving aggression. Now, not only can dopamine be broken down, but it also can be taken up once again by the neuron which made it. And so these are transporters, and variations here can affect personality as well. So certainly personality is governed by one's parents, one's life experiences, one's education. Damage to specific brain regions can influence personality. But brains are made of cells, and cells do things like make signals which are made in neuron number 1, travel to neuron number 2, maybe taken up again. And the genetic variations which affect the synthesis, perception, reuptake, or breakdown of dopamine, these can actually have some effect on our personality. Dopamine is obviously not the only message which is sent in the brain. So for example, serotonin is made in the RAF nuclei, and then axons project it to various brain regions, and serotonin is also an important signaling factor in the brain. Now, while all of us would make serotonin, there would be individual variations, once again, in how much serotonin is synthesized, how it binds to receptors, and then how it is taken up again afterwards and or broken down. So once again, if one considers what genes are we conceived with, for the enzymes which will start with tryptophan, an amino acid which we encounter in our diet, and convert it into the signaling neurotransmitter serotonin. Once again, we vary in the production of these enzymes, and variations can be associated with a number of personality issues, such as anxiety. Not only can serotonin vary in how much of it is made, but then also how it is perceived. So these are serotonin receptors. And we have different serotonin receptors, which are expressed in different parts of the brain. And so some uh, then lead to um, differing issues when they vary, such as dependence, susceptibility to certain mental illnesses, response to medications, um, and other issues. So we vary in our production of serotonin. We vary in its perception, and then whether it is broken down or taken up again. Once again, this can vary. So here is the transporter SERT, which can take serotonin after it has been used at a synapse and then repackaged into the the original neuron. But variations in this transporter can then be correlated with differing levels in anxiety, depression, suicidal behavior, alcohol dependence, um, and others. And so this is just meant as an introduction to the idea of traits being multifactorial.
Because I make high level.
With multifactorial traits, there is not one single cause. So for example, in genetics, a term which was once hypothesized is sometimes abbreviated OGOD, O-G-O-D, which is one gene, one disease. We now know that doesn't apply. It doesn't apply to heart disease. There are lots of genes and lots of environmental factors which affect heart disease and asthma, etc. And if you were to ask, are there biological factors which are, say, involved in, we'll just pick a personality trait. Let's pick aggression, for example. The answer would be yes. So there are hormones such as the testosterone made in the testes, the androgens made in adrenal glands in men and women, neurosteroids, FSH, prolactin, nitric oxide synthase, and others. These are known to affect levels of aggression in humans. And like I had mentioned before, many of these are observed in other experimental mammals such as mice, showing that some of the organization of the mammalian brain is such that, for example, mutations in nitric oxide synthase or monoamine oxidase would cause similar increases in aggression in male mice and male humans, but not in females, in either mice or humans. So once again, some similarities in brain architecture. But then once again, the idea of being multifactorial, there isn't just biology which affects our personality. Certainly, our upbringing, our parentage, traumatic events, and so, lead that we're exposed to, alcohol and drugs, the cholesterol in our diet. Very low cholesterol diets can increase aggression, stress, etc. All of these can then be factors. And so many aspects of personality thus are multifactorial. We have to consider both what genes one is conceived with, maybe then some things which have affected the brain, such as injury, but then also a host of environmental and social factors as well. Just a couple of other examples. So for example, autism is certainly complex. In a simplistic way, one could ask, what is the cause of autism? So is there, say, an autism gene? Well, we know of many genes. We don't, at last I had read, don't feel that there is one gene whose variation in the population is primarily responsible for autism, or responsible for the majority of cases. But there are a number of genes on a number of chromosomes which are known to increase risk of autism, or in individual cases because of autism, but not in others. Then there are environmental factors which can cause autism, such as mercury exposure, and thus we were concerned about mercury levels in coal and how that undergoes magnification through food chains. But then there also can be other factors, such as a medication taken by a woman during pregnancy, which would increase risk of autism. And so the brain, like the heart in heart disease or the lungs in asthma, is suspect to both genetic and environmental influences. You could pick a disorder such as microcephaly. There are certainly genes which can cause microcephaly, and then there are environmental factors such as the Zika virus, which can be transmitted with mosquito bites. And so once again, genes and environment are capable of affecting the brain and influencing personality. So once again, genes can certainly affect the brain, such as Tay-Sachs disease, which tragically leads to a non-curable deterioration of the brain as toxic sphingolipids build up in the brain in affected individuals. So, genes can certainly affect the brain, but so too can the environment. So for example, if I was conceived with phenylketonuria, that could have caused retardation as a toxic phenylalanine builds up in my brain. But if I had gone a special diet, which was would have reduced the amount of phenylalanine, then I might, be normal. And so, the gene alone is not determining the outcome. So, this would apply to, many things, which, when we look at, dementia, Alzheimer's later in life, there are certainly genes which are involved, but there is more to it than that in affecting risk, etc. And I'm just going to wrap this up. But if we were to consider any aspect of the brain, so for example, our stress response, how we respond to stress, our level of frustration, etc. This is certainly something which is a factor in our personality, our mood, our drives, etc. But there are certainly hormones involved in this. Their receptors vary. And so as we go from one individual to another, the physiological response of stress varies based on, the hormones that we make, the receptors to these hormones, etc. And so in many of my courses, we look at things like heart disease, asthma, weight gain as being multifactorial, influenced by a large number of genes and environmental factors. And so it's the combinations which one receives. And then when we deal with the brain, which is the most complex structure of the known universe, and the personality, which we can, study and which fascinates us at so many levels, certainly there is a great deal of biology involved, but there is room for both, the genes, the substrate of the brain itself, and then all of our environmental factors, such as, our experiences, our exposure to, different elements of diet and drugs, and poisons like lead, et cetera, which influence personality.